going to do is give you a flavor of the kind of thinking that goes into many of the policies that you hear, you see in recent years, and hopefully I'll try and convince you that we are not as crazy as many people may think. So right in the beginning, thank you very much, Sangam Talks, for hosting me. The topic, as was just mentioned, it's economics and policy making for uncertain times. And of course, we live now currently in a very uncertain times. But the point that I would like to make is that we always live in uncertain times because the future is always uncertain. And how does one make policy under those circumstances? Now, in order to explain what I mean, I first need to give you some idea of how conventional thinking around many of these issues, particularly economic issues, has been over the last century and a half. This is important because much of the economics that I will describe is very cutting edge economics. Some of it may sound completely common sense, but evidently economists could not deal with some obvious things in their economic models. And this has got to do with the fact that much of the field of economics is going through a churn, not dissimilar to maybe what the field of physics went through maybe in the 1920s after the Einsteinian revolution, or the field of biology went through in the mid-19th century after the Darwinian revolution. Economics as a field is going through a massive churn. And old ways of thinking are being thrown into the dustbin and new ways of thinking are being brought in. Many of these are not yet in the textbooks, but I hope to give you some flavor of it. So first of all, remember that economics as taught in the textbooks and much of the public debate formed in the early 20th century and late 19th century. And therefore, the intellectual basis of much of it is really Newtonian mechanics. This is why much of economics uses terminology that is derived directly from Victorian steam engines. So you have terms like equilibrium, or you will have terms like levers of monetary and fiscal policy, or liquidity, which is a hydraulic term, and so on and so forth. Why do you have this? Because the entire intellectual framework is derived from Newtonian mechanics. And this leads to a sort of economics where there is a great amount of thought and energy spent in looking for an optimal equilibrium. So economics basically gives you the impression that there is a trend line, we can call it the railway lines, and the steam engine is running on it. If the steam engine slows down too much, then you shovel some more coal in. You can call it monetary or fiscal or demand stimulus or whatever you like to call it. And if it speeds up too much, then you have to pull the brake. And a lot of economics ends up basically sounding like as if you're running some sort of a steam engine. And how do you then, people will, experts will come and give you these long range and very confidently give you these very long range forecasts about what the trend line is and whether you have deviated or gone back to the trend line and so on. But the fact of the matter is, we don't live in such a deterministic world. In fact, if you had asked any economist back in the end of 2019 about, all the things that happened in 2020 and 2021, the economic shock from COVID, the unraveling of the geopolitics of the previous round of economic expansion, and so on, most economists will simply not be able to predict it. It's not like these things were and have never happened. It's a possibility, but I don't think any economist really would have had this in their forecast. Now, somebody I know at this point will say, this is it's true that this is not an environment of an equilibrium that we live in now, but these are very unusual times. And surely we can discount this for most times. In fact, not. If you go back 10 years, were we in equilibrium? No, we had just come out of the great financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9. And at that time also, anybody who had asked, any economist you had asked Are we in equilibrium? They would have said no. So you go back another decade back to 2000, and were we in equilibrium then? Well, we had just gone through the Asian crisis, and there was the dot-com blowout. Were we in equilibrium then? Well, no. Then perhaps we go back another decade to 1990. Were we in equilibrium then? We had just seen the Berlin Wall falling. The Soviet Union had collapsed. We ourselves went through a major economic crisis and carried out huge reforms. We were not in equilibrium then either. And you can keep going back through all of history and you will decide, you will find that in fact, we have never been in equilibrium. It's actually this idea of an equilibrium in economics or socio-political systems is basically it's just a belief. It's a superstition. Nobody has ever seen an equilibrium, and yet all of economics is based on trying to find this optimal equilibrium and optimizing to this equilibrium. So much of economics, whether socialist or capitalist, is basically based on this idea, which nobody has ever seen. The only difference between those who believe in socialist type policies and neoliberal market economics, not all market economics, but neoliberal market economics, is the following. That the socialists believe that some wise men and bureaucrats sitting in the planning commission know where this optimal equilibrium is, and they know how to get to this optimal equilibrium. This is basically the main point that this is the basic idea of the socialists. And the basic idea of the neoliberal market economists is that this optimal equilibrium exists and the market miraculously through the invisible hand takes you to it. Now notice that both of them are basically based on this idea that this optimal equilibrium is a reality. What if instead you think of a world where there is no such optimal equilibrium, that you're continuously buffeted, it's a chaotic world where you're continuously buffeted by new technologies, new social systems, new geopolitics, natural disasters of the kind we are going through right now, and so on. If this is what we are going through, then the world is continuously in churn and there is no optimal equilibrium to aspire to. Now, if that is the world we live in, then much of mainstream economics is basically bunkum. And so how do you then make policy for this churning, uncertain, continuously evolving world? And that is basically what I'm going to talk to you about. Now, look at the policies that we have done in the last 1 year as an example of what you do when you're dealing with uncertainty. How do you make policies in such an uncertain world? And I can say this from the horse's mouth because I have myself done this. It's not something I've read about. This is what it really feels like when you're dealing with uncertainty. Let's go back to March of 2020. What is the information that you had on the COVID crisis? Basically, what you knew was that something bad had happened in China and that it had spread to northern Italy, where it had killed a lot of people. That is basically the sum total of all you knew about what was going on. The WHO was totally unhelpful about what to do about this, and more or less nobody knew what was going on. So, like every country in the world, we called in the experts and they asked them, what do you think is happening with this coronavirus? And they gave us a whole range of outcomes. Some experts thought that this was just a bad flu. And some experts told us that, this is going to kill millions of people within the next 3-4 months. You'll remember all these debates from that time. Now, different governments took different approaches to this. One approach was you choose amongst all these possible outcomes and you go with whichever of these forecasts you think is the most likely. So this is how you ended up with, say, the Swedish model, or for example, the UK initially saying, we are going to go for herd immunity and so on and so forth. This is all based on choosing the forecast of a particular expert which you think is credible. Now, here in India, we knew that once we chose whatever we did, whichever strategy we did, we would end up in a bad situation because it would mean that once you go down that path, you can't change it. With 1.35 billion people, you can't change path. So what do you do? So we took the view that we had no idea what was going to happen. In other words, we were dealing with complete uncertainty. If you are dealing with complete uncertainty, how do you make policy? So there are many strategies for dealing with complete uncertainty. One strategy is known as the barbell strategy, where basically what you do is you hedge for the very worst outcome on one hand, and then you do a Bayesian updating over time as more information becomes available. So this is basically the context in which we did the first original lockdown. What were we doing? We were hedging for the very worst outcome. In case it turned out that COVID was just as as dangerous as the very worst expectations of the most pessimistic expert, then at least we had shut down the system. Now, it's not like we didn't know there was a major economic cost to be paid from it. Of course, everybody knew that. But we had to do that because if the very worst thing was going to happen, it was going to spread through the whole system and kill millions of people, then the best we could do is to shut down the system right in the beginning, while we did the second part of the barbell, which is step by step gather more information. So that first lockdown was about gathering more information, putting in place some quarantining, testing capability, and so on and so forth. Now, as time passed, we had better information about it. So we found out that it's particularly bad for a certain cohort, people with comorbidities, older people, and so on. We found out that it affects the lungs and breathing and so on. And so we began to get a certain amount of information that's airborne, for example, that masks makes a difference. So then you begin putting in place certain steps that then you begin to take. And meanwhile, you begin to open things up. And so if you remember, the cases peaked last year in September. But by September, we had substantially opened up the economy. Now, people will immediately ask, why were you opening up the system where in September, when you had lots of more cases than when you had shut it down in the beginning? Well, for obvious reasons, because we had more information. If we have more information, we therefore knew that, well, while it was very dangerous, it wasn't quite as dangerous as the worst case. We also knew that there were certain things we could do to mitigate the risks. So that is the context in which we kept things shut. So now we did exactly the same thing with economic policy. We basically, when we shut things down, we knew there would be a big economic price to be paid. If you're shutting down an economy for several weeks at a time, it doesn't take a genius to realize that there's a price to be paid. But then, if you will remember, a lot of experts came and said, you must reinflate the economy, open it up and sort of pump it as fast as possible. Well, wait a minute. This is not a demand side problem. The real problem is a supply one where you have shut down the system. That is the real problem. And you don't want to pump up demand too quickly because you have, for health reasons, shut things down. So rather than go and do these $1 trillion reinflation packages, which many countries did, and at least in my view, not very successfully, we did much more controlled effort, where just like with the barbell strategy, we basically spent the money on the most vulnerable sections of society. So the world's largest food program, 800 million people were given food. We put some money into the Jan Dhan accounts. This was not, as many people said, oh, too little to kind of reinflate the economy. We weren't trying to reinflate the economy, but we were providing a safety net. Same thing we did with the MSME sector. We provided liquidity. We held the insolvency and bankruptcy code in abeyance because we didn't want cascades of defaults going through the system. Why were we doing all of this? Well, this is one part of the barbell. You're providing a safety net. This is not an attempt to reinflate the economy at all. On the other side, we recognized that we were in a marathon and not a sprint. We therefore did a series of medium-sized packages while we opened things up. And when you remember in October last year, we then began to ramp up capital expenditure. Why capital expenditure? Well, because it has many very strong multiplier effects on demand. And you saw the economy came back very sharply between October and March. So much so that in the Jan to October quarter, we were back to where we were before COVID. It's a different matter that we got hit by the second wave, but you can see that this is an iterative process where we are continuously updating ourselves with information. This is not based on some grand model looking forward or our ability to predict forward. We have accepted the fact that we do not know how to predict if and when a second wave will come. And by the way, if and when a third wave will come. I know there are many IITs and various experts who have all these models. Well, it's impossible to tell ex ante which of those models will tell you what is going to happen. You see, if enough monkeys throw darts at the dartboard, one or two of them is going to hit the bullseye. The problem is it's very difficult to tell which monkey is going to hit the bullseye. So in those circumstances, it is better to assume that we do not know. So the premium here is not our ability to forecast, but our ability to do two things. One, to hedge for the very worst outcome. Two, to do continuous surveillance and respond quickly. So this is a reactive model at its first instance in the short to medium term. So you can see this is one part of the way we are thinking about it. So the same approach was applied in the second wave. We allowed to decentralize the response to COVID because by this point we had better information and we decided that the state governments are able to respond much faster than the central government. For obvious reasons, they are closer to the ground. So it makes much more sense to decentralize lockdowns, and this is exactly what we did. So although the health spike was much more severe in the second wave, the health response did not have a national lockdown. Why? For the very simple reason, we took the view that if this is a feedback-based system, then this is clearly going to be much better run on the ground. We had initially also thought that this was the case with vaccination, incidentally, but we decided later on that this was better run centralized. Again, feedback loop, we found that it runs better from a centralized system, and indeed that has been the case. So this is one case where a centralized system works better, and you can see that we have been able to ramp up vaccination dramatically, and we are now routinely hitting as many as 10 million in a day of vaccination jabs. So again, feedback loop based system. Now, this you may argue is all right in the short run, but how do you go forward? Well, same situation for the response to COVID. I am a much bigger advocate of continuous testing and surveillance as opposed to great belief in anybody's models. So do not believe anybody's models, just do continuously keep a high level of testing going. And you would have seen that if you look at the testing numbers, after the first wave, the testing levels slowly drifted down. We have tried to keep the testing levels as high as possible. And by the way, in other countries, you will see testing goes up and down quite a lot. In our case, while there is some ups and downs, but by and large, the testing pace remains at a reasonably high level, even after the number of cases have come down. And that is an important part of our strategy because surveillance is an important part of our approach. Similarly, making sure what is the positivity rate, watching that very carefully is an important part of our strategy. Now, the same thing is being done on the economic front. We are opening things up gingerly, maybe, but we are opening things up. And by and large, except for things like international travel and other things where we have still some health concerns, we have tried to open things up. So, of course, you got in the April to June quarter, 20% GDP growth, which on a year-on-year basis happened at least partly because of the fact that you had a low base. But remember, this year's quarter in the second wave also had some lockdown. So it's not an entirely open system that you're comparing it with. Nevertheless, you have seen a significant part of the economy coming back. Into this quarter also, you are seeing things coming back. Now, our intention is to keep things as open as possible, even if a third wave comes, obviously keeping in mind various health restrictions that we may have to impose. But keeping things as open as possible is an important part of our strategy. And again, it's important in this context to be, the situation awareness is a very important part of what we want to do. Now, what about then the longer term? People say, okay, short-term shocks, you can deal with it. What about the longer term strategy about economic policy? What about the post-COVID world? So here also, the same point is valid. The post-COVID world is not going to be a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. I have no idea, no matter what various experts may do on PowerPoint and various consultants may do with nice, colorful graphs. I have no idea how the world will be in 10 years' time. I do not know what technologies will have succeeded and which will have failed. I do not know how the geopolitics will have evolved. And you can see that these things can change overnight, as happened in Afghanistan. I don't know how consumer behavior will be. I have no idea about many, many things. So how do I make policy for a world which I do not know, especially in the long term? Well, in this context, let me say two things matter. One is resilience against shocks. Two, flexibility and adaptation. Now, I want to make this clear that this is not so different from the barbell strategy I was talking about earlier. Basically, the point is adapt to things as they happen as well as possible and have a safety net, have resilience, and be able to take the hit if and when some big shock comes and hits you. Now, that hit could be natural disaster, it could be external aggression, it could be any number of other things. It could be health emergency, it could be any number of other things. So having state capacity to deal with that is important. Having industrial capacity and intellectual capacity to be able to do that is also important. At the same time, you need to flexibly move forward. So let me show you how we have incorporated that into economic policy. And importantly, how does that fit with the idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which, as I will show you, has nothing to do with pre-1991 import substitution and license permit Raj, which some people think it may be connected to. It is not. So if I'm dealing with such a lot of uncertainty, the most important thing obviously is that our factor markets are flexible, right? Our labor force should be able to deal with the new exigencies. We should be able to reallocate resources, land and state resources. We should be able to open out and deregulate new sectors and be able to move forward. So now you can see very clearly the kinds of policies we have done, particularly in the last 18 months, but even in the longer run. Why, for example, one of the important things that this government has done is insolvency and bankruptcy. Because this is a part of creative destruction. Keeping alive inefficient companies is a bad thing. In the old days, in the name of, saving jobs and so on, we would very often keep these dinosaur companies alive for decades, when in fact they were gobbling up huge amounts of resources which could be deployed in doing other things. But we didn't do that because we didn't have a conception of creative destruction. We had these ideas that giving out licenses would somehow, some bureaucrat sitting in Delhi knew what kinds of outcomes and technologies were going to emerge. And in fact, you had the ironical situation of many industry bodies, and this happens even today, coming and saying, the government should create a fund and invest in technologies. You've got to be kidding me. What on earth makes you think that a bureaucrat knows where the future is going to be? If he knew, why on earth is he wasting his time as a joint secretary in department of XYZ? He should be Elon Musk. So this entire approach is fundamentally flawed. So what you need here is to open things up. And just in the last few months, you would have seen, we have introduced a drone policy, a very liberal drone policy, allows you to experiment. Now, we know some things may go wrong, but that's okay. All experimentation is based on things going wrong. Same thing has happened with opening up the geospatial and cartography sector. It used to be a monopoly of the Survey of India. We opened it up completely. Now, all kinds of people are coming and doing all kinds of interesting things in this sector. We removed telecom regulations on the BPO and IT enabled services. Very heavy regulations were there for reasons that are entirely inexplicable They were there for some 20 odd years and were getting in the way of innovation. We have gotten rid of those as well. In the financial sector, we have created something called bilateral netting that allows for the CDS market to evolve. Now, of course, derivatives can be misused, but on the other hand, not having them means that an entire area of finance and risk taking doesn't get evolved, whether it's corporate debt markets or derivatives. So while you do need to retain certain regulations to be able to sort of hedge out the very worst behavior of people who deal with these instruments, simply saying that we shouldn't allow them is a bad idea. The same thing is true of trade invoice factoring. We used to never allow this, whereas it is an obvious way to get quick financing to the MSME sector by allowing them to raise finances against their invoices. But we didn't allow it till just about a month ago. And the trade factoring bill has now opened that up. The rules should be out any day now. And an entirely new area of financing is open for our banks and NBFCs. So you can see that this is a consistent thinking about deregulation. The same thinking is there about getting the labor laws done. For, when I was at university some 30 odd years ago, labor laws were being discussed even at that time. We didn't do anything till just a year or two ago. And now India has got completely liberal labor laws, which protect labor where it needs to be protected and is flexible where it needs to be flexible so that you can redeploy our labor force. Exact same thinking behind our monetization and privatization. If you've got resources that are stuck in old mill lands in, say, Kanpur, they should be redeployed. It's about flexibility and adaptation. Just because, 100 years ago, this real estate was valuable for running a textile mill in the middle of Kanpur doesn't mean today it doesn't have better uses. Surely using those hundreds of acres, which happen to be in the middle of Kanpur, should be used to create new parks, new hospitals, new residential areas, new offices, and other urban amenities that that city needs. Instead, those lands which are valuable are simply lying there. This is true of old derelict warehouses along the Hooghly River in Kolkata, or the old port area of Mumbai. These need to be monetized and redeployed. This is the point about continuous churn. It does not matter what some great planner decades ago thought, because the world has moved on. And the same mistake we do with urban planning. So you can clearly see how this kind of thinking is different from the old thinking. Now let me show you how this fits with Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, obviously, when you're living in this very uncertain, evolving, churning world, you will get all kinds of shocks. You should be prepared for them. So if we are saying Atmanirbhar Bharat, what we are really saying is that we need to leverage our internal strengths to create the ability to deal with obvious threats to our economic security. I'll illustrate this because there is an illustration is always better than any number of arguments. We all know that we have a very competitive pharmaceutical sector. Yeah, everybody knows that. However, during this last 18 months, we discovered that this competitive pharmaceutical sector is extremely dependent on single source foreign inputs. So there were these APIs which we are dependent on, and if for whatever reason these sources get disrupted, then we can have all this rest of capacity to do all these generics and other drugs, but it doesn't matter because these APIs have suddenly stalled. Now, from purely optimization perspective, it makes sense to import because it's cheaper. But from a resilience perspective, it is important that we have some capacity to do it in-house if they are so important. It doesn't matter. I'm not just saying it's China and we should be suspicious of them, etc. It could be even an ally country which doesn't supply it to you because a sudden shock hits them, or for whatever reason their own politics didn't allow you to export it, as happened in fact with an input into one of our vaccines, or for example the fact that we do not have chips manufacturing capacity means that we have this huge automobiles industry where we do 99% of the manufacturing, but because we don't have chips, now this capacity has to be rolled back. So this is a very good illustration where we need, for at least for basic activities, we need to be Atmanirbhar. Now notice, this is not the conception of Atmanirbhar Bharat as in license permit Raj or going back to import substitution of the pre-1991 era, because that Nehruvian view was based on a fear of the rest of the world. Ours is to actually compete in the next of the world. We want to compete in global supply chains. We may not have signed up to RCEP, but that doesn't mean we have an ideological problem with trade deals. We are equally aggressively pursuing trade deals with Australia, with the EU, with Europe, even with the US, even as we speak. So our purpose is to actually participate in global supply chains and compete. And even here, we are willing to do things which would have been anathema to an earlier generation of policymakers. For example, the PLI scheme. The PLI scheme is quite a major intellectual break for Indian bureaucracy because it essentially supports and encourages those who are trying to become ever bigger. There is an inbuilt bias against expansion and clustering and scale in our policies because of misdirection of our idea that we need to help MSMEs. Yes, we need to help MSMEs, but we don't need to help them. We want to help them to become big. Stopping MSMEs from becoming big as a way of helping MSMEs is surely a bizarre way of thinking about it. The point about helping MSMEs is to make them bigger, not to keep them as midgets. So you will see that in the economic survey, we in fact use those terms. So this idea has been now become policy through the PLI scheme, where we actually reward companies and sectors for scaling up to global competitive levels. And you can see that that has been quite successful in electronic type things. We have now introduced it in textiles just 2 days ago, and many other sectors as well. And let's see what happens. Now, not all of them will succeed. That's fine. The kind of approach we have of creative destruction allows for some amount of failure, which is perfectly fine. But some of it must succeed, and some of it will succeed. And then we will make our way forward. You can clearly see then how our policy making is based. It's basically based on risk-taking, encouraging risk-taking. It is based on opening and deregulation. It means redeploying of government resources away from things where it is stuck and is wastefully being deployed through monetization, getting resources opened up, one, to allow the private sector to do its stuff, but also giving us resources to do things that the government should be doing. It's not like the government needs to withdraw all the time. There are good things the government needs to do. And this brings me to the end of my talk. I'm going to just take out what are the next generation of reforms we should think about. So the last 30 years of reforms have all been about withdrawing the government from things it should not do. And while we haven't finished that agenda, at least most of that has now been announced, I would argue. And I think with the exception maybe of direct taxes, where we still need to really get our act together, we have mostly done all the large framework reforms, at least announced our intentions, whether it's privatization, where privatization may not have, it's a process that has far from finished, but at least you know where we are going with it. Labor reforms, even farm reforms, we may have held it in abeyance, but you know that we are committed to a particular direction of movement. But the next generation of reforms is not about withdrawal of the Indian state. It is about getting the Indian state to do the things it should do. So from getting away from things it should not do, now the next 30 years should be about getting the Indian state to do the things it should do. So what are those things? Well, very high up in that list has got to be the ability of our legal system to deliver justice and enforce contracts. If you're living in an uncertain world, then you obviously means that things will go wrong. And if things go wrong, you need to be able to enforce contracts for the situations where things go wrong. So seen from this complexity and uncertainty prism, which is the economics I espouse, legal system reform is the single biggest issue that we need to pursue. Now, you can debate on how to go about it, and that's a different lecture, but you can be clear that having 40 million cases stuck in the pipeline is not only a travesty of justice, it is also deadly for the economic model that I just described. So it must be fixed. The same thing is true for administrative reforms. With the economic model that I just described, you cannot have a administrative system and bureaucracy of the kind we have, not merely because of all the endemic rent seeking that all of you probably have to face, but also the sheer lethargy of a system that is based on not on principles, but on precedent and blind following of outdated rules. We need to update those rules on a routine basis through a feedback loop. We need systems where we encourage our bureaucracy to be able to use their common sense and deal with situations in first principle basis, rather than blindly perpetuating old ideas. And this is an important thing because, very often the Indian bureaucracy very proudly thinks of itself as the steel frame of India. The fact is that steel frame is only a useful thing if you're thinking in Newtonian terms and you're thinking of the world and of economic systems as rigid frameworks, and therefore you need a rigid system to deal with it. On the other hand, if you think in complexity theory terms as fluid systems, then you can see that the bureaucracy, far from being a steel frame, is basically a rusting cage and needs to be opened up in order to be able to allow innovation, risk-taking, and entrepreneurship. That should be the real driver of growth. And I always say that we don't have to wait for the GDP growth numbers from 10 years hence to know whether we succeeded. We can very quickly tell whether we are succeeding and the system is moving in the correct direction from simply talking to our teenagers. Ask them what they want to be when they want to grow up. If they want to grow up and want to be civil servants, then we haven't made progress. If they, on the other hand, want to be sportsmen, entrepreneurs, scientists, writers, then we are making progress because they want to do things that are risk-taking. That means we have entered into an era where that is the dominant culture of our society is one of risk-taking, as opposed to wanting to join some sort of a rent-seeking activity. So that will be far before we get the GDP number read. You will be able to see that whether or not our economy is moving in the correct direction from the feedback that you will get from our teenagers. With that, let me stop. I'm sure there are lots of questions and I'm happy to answer them.
He's interested to know about the Indian investments in the neighboring countries like Iran, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. How are these investments going to help India in future?
Obviously, when you are dealing with neighboring countries, there are many reasons you want to invest there. One of them is geopolitical. Obviously, if you want influence in those countries and to build good relations with them, then you need to spend some money, especially if you have pretensions of being a regional power. Then you need to be able to demonstrate that. So that is the context in which you may build, for example, a parliament for Afghanistan and so on. The other reason is obviously the physical infrastructure. I mean, if you want to trade with these countries, you need to build the physical infrastructure. And if you are the stronger partner, you are expected in some ways to build the roads or ports or whatever it is to do it. Third, purely business. I mean, very often building so many of these things is a commercially viable activity. Not always, but it can be. and it is worth our while to do it purely for commercial reasons. So there are a whole bunch of reasons why you may want to do investments in neighboring countries. Obviously, I'm ignoring here private investments, which are obviously purely of commercial nature. Now, this is not to suggest that there aren't risks in this. We put in a lot of infrastructure and spending into Afghanistan. It's very difficult to know right now what will happen to them. So, like with anything, you invest. All investments entail some amount of risk, but the idea is that if you do enough of it and you manage it well and you pay attention to it, on the whole, you will benefit.
This is from C.S. Mandar Karnik from Thane. He asks, now that the global geopolitics is undergoing rapid change, has the time for gradual reforms in India ended and rapid change in policy the need of the hour?
Now, that's quite an amusing question, because this government is mostly accused of doing too many changes. So that may have been a fair question to ask previous governments. I think we are very often accused of doing too much. But if you look at the last 5 years, look at the changes we have introduced. Just in the last 5 years, we have created an insolvency and bankruptcy framework, which didn't exist, which allows for a huge amount of churn as a matter of course in our economy. We introduced a GST system. We completely radically changed the way our indirect tax system works. I don't think anybody will argue those weren't radical changes. And in both cases, while there were very niggling problems initially, I think most people will agree that broadly they work quite well today. And they were definitely a big improvement on whatever was there before. We have done, I gave a long list of changes we did, whether it's in drone policy or in various kinds of science-related policies we have done in recent times, and opened up enormous sectors to reform, to competition. We are now entering into a phase where we have promised to do privatization and monetization. We have even attempted to do radical reforms in agriculture. So I don't know what you're talking about. If we did more, I think you would be the one complaining. Even the education system, we are continuously looking for ways of changing, and we have introduced a new education policy, but I have a sneaking feeling that we may have to revise that too, given the changes that are happening thanks to COVID in terms of distance learning and how conversant it has become, we have all become, in terms of doing teaching and other things online. I can't believe that the very model of education radically has not changed worldwide, and we need to adapt to that. So absolutely, we need to continuously adapt and change. The important part, however, of complexity theory is, and this is where you have to understand where we are coming from. Our entire strategy, however, is not based on doing radical changes in, say, the Maoist, cultural revolution way. Because we do not claim to know where the future is. We are very much evolutionary reformers. We will keep doing changes and tinkering at the edges all the time. Now, people may find that disconcerting initially, because things do not ever settle down. But our purpose is to continuously change. And now those who are in the IT sector will know exactly what we are doing. It's called agile. Yeah, you can either introduce a system that is perfect, or you can introduce a system and keep fixing it. And this is how we have introduced changes. GST, initially, there were lots of problems, but eventually it was a good system. It's a much better system than it is today. I can assure you, to the person who asked the question, that when they are running this system, they will be using some version of the GST we have introduced. Hopefully, they'll have gotten rid of more of the niggling problems we have today. But I can assure you, even at that time, they will be fixing things. And there were many other changes where we will keep doing that. And that is true also of urban planning. This idea that Chandigarh is a perfect city and we should freeze it there is a bad idea. Great cities are cities that evolve continuously. The great cities of the world, whether London or Paris or you name any city, they have gone through radical changes continuously, or Singapore. Singapore is not the result of some grand plan. It's not this. It's Singapore's success is not planning. It's management of change. It has radically changed over the last 40 years, whereas Chandigarh has remained basically the same. I mean, the changes in Chandigarh happen outside of the plan in Mohali, but not in Chandigarh. So the point I'm making is, it is continuous ability to transition and change. That is what this model is about. Radical changes, yes, but they will always be evolutionary.
Before I go on to the audience, I'm really tempted to ask this part about the GST. Right after the GST was introduced, I saw your talk where you said how it was a really progressive reform. I would like you to touch upon it.
Okay. See, till we introduced GST, India used to have an extremely complicated indirect tax system. There were different kinds of taxes all over the country. The different states had taxes, even different cities had taxes. People have forgotten already, but there used to be something called octroi. And even, goods going in and out of a city would be taxed at a different thing. So you can imagine how confusing and complicated this was. So it was so complicated that it was easier for Mumbai to trade with Shanghai than it was for Mumbai to trade with Delhi. Because if a product went from Mumbai to Delhi, it had to go through all these state borders, then trucks would get stuck. There would be different rates, there would be smuggling. This is a source of a lot of graft that used to happen, because obviously tax rates are different in different states. So I can imagine there was, forget smuggling in and out of India, there was smuggling in between states in India. So all of this complicated stuff was going on. And then we introduced GST that for most products, I would say 99.9% of products, we now across the country have the same tax system. This is a radical change, okay? Simply trashing the old system and introducing a new system. Now, it is something we had debated, by the way. Everybody knew this problem, by the way. It's not a new problem we discovered in 2017, okay? It's a problem we knew for decades. And for decades, we said we must do something about this. Then finally it was done. Now, when it was done, those who introduced it knew that it wouldn't work for many months. Now everybody says, oh, it didn't work for so long. Of course it won't work. If you do any radical change of that kind, it won't work. It won't work partly because the website, etc., will have problems. It won't work because you will find unintended consequences. In fact, most of the things that went wrong weren't the things that people had predicted, but were things that nobody had predicted. Nobody had predicted that the correction button in the form XYZ, whatever it was going to be the major problem because it didn't work. Everybody had predicted 200 other things. So the point is that the GST system could only be made to work through an agile approach. You introduce a reasonable system. I'm not saying introduce a bad system, introduce a system that is reasonable, then fix it along the way. If we had waited for a perfect system, we wouldn't have been able to introduce it even today. And kicking and screaming, it eventually gets done. So that is generally true for most changes. Even I can tell you, the changes needed in the farm laws, you ask any expert on farming, we'll eventually have to get away from this business of growing large amounts of cereals, which we don't need to eat. We are expending huge amounts of resources to subsidize the growing of grains we don't need, poisoning the earth with chemicals they should be pumping into them, pumping out groundwater, which climate change will probably mean that at some future date we will need this water, and we're pumping it out. This is a completely wasteful, and then we put it into a marketing system that is also completely wasteful, where neither the farmer nor the consumer benefits, but there is a huge inefficient middleman system that causes inefficiencies and extracts rent. Clearly that system had to at some point change, and everybody agrees it needs to be changed, right? Even those who are now opposing these changes do not disagree that there is a problem. Now, okay, maybe the changes we made need to be tinkered at the edges to smoothen them. Okay, that's fair enough. But the only way you'll be able to make these changes is to introduce them, start the political process, start the debate, and through iteration, smoothen out the edges and then finally get it done. But if you do not push for those changes, they will never get done.
You talked about the policy making, like in this changing and fluid world, which makes total sense. Just out of curiosity, when the government announced demonetization, what was the government was trying to do?
So this is something you should ask Arvind Subramaniam, because this belongs to before I joined the government. So I can't quite comment because I don't know the initial thinking. You can have both ex post justifications and arguments. So my entire approach, as you can see, is ex ante. I mean, the whole point about the approach I'm talking about is an ex ante thinking process. How do you deal with something that you don't know about? So I do not know exactly what the ex ante thinking was because I wasn't in the government at that time. But my own thinking was that my own understanding from that time. So this is from before I joined the government. So there's no insider thought here. This is my understanding is that one part of it was that there was a large amount of cash in the system that was sloshing around and distorting markets and political and social incentives. More importantly, there was also probably a lack of clarity about how much money was actually in the system. Remember that we had gone through decades where all kinds of money had been pumped into the system in various ways. For example, Telegi scam. There had been Pakistani counterfeiting, in domestic counterfeiting. And then there had, many years, you needed at least a one-time audit of how much physical cash existed in the system, replace that cash with money that was not counterfeited, and also force everybody to go. It's like if you have no idea where and how, supposing you had a system where there were no cars, there were cars in the country, but you didn't know who owned them. Let's say you have no idea about the registration of cars in this country, okay? Because for some reason, all the registers have got wiped out. Okay, now eventually you want everybody to register the cars, but very quickly, if you wanted to do some way of getting a sense of what was going on, you basically say that everybody has to go through some toll gate, and you have a toll gate with a camera, which kind of gets a sense of, okay, who owns the cars roughly? Where are the cars? Are they all in Delhi? You get a sense of this. So I would say that was what demonetization really was. So get a sense of what the thing was, knock out some of the worst aspects of it, and essentially impose a sense of order. If you're familiar with the broken window theory, you will know simply imposing a sense of order on a system has its benefits. When you have a system that is essentially broken. If you go back to 2015-16, what was the situation we were in? We had come off a stage where large numbers of scams had happened. The banking system was all over the shop. Nobody knew what was the assets they had. There was large amounts of graft going on. And there was a general sense of things being out of control. So demonetization, quite apart from the monetary aspect of it, can be seen perhaps as simply an imposition of state control on the system and a signaling that, yes, we run this place and we can impose our order on it. Now, as I said, this is my understanding of what was the thinking at that time. I was not in the government, so you will need to talk to somebody who was in the government at that time to tell you what was the thinking then.
It seems to me that maybe we also need to look at some way of simplifying our messages, our sort of mass communication of the narrative, so that these things are sort of taken in the right spirit. Obviously, you talking about it, influence a slightly different set of people, and I think most of us can agree that these are reforms in the right spirit and go in the right direction. That's just one suggestion that I wanted to make through this conversation.
So thank you very much for that feedback. Obviously, why am I spending my weekends doing these talks is to get the message out. So, but I take your point that, in the end, maybe I have a limited audience of relatively better educated people who probably are, but then there is some good, hopefully, that comes from it, because in some ways you are the people who amplify it by talking to other people, writing articles, etc. So this kind of talk that I'm giving here would not perhaps work with a audience on the street, because it's perhaps a bit intellectualized, but it is important to get that underlying philosophy out there, because at the street level, you can only explain individual policies. Explaining the underlying philosophy is perhaps a bit too difficult. Over time, people will imbibe it perhaps unconsciously, but that is a longer term process that will feed through you to articles, through eventually into the education system, and then become generalized. But this is part of why I'm doing this. But point taken about the wider communications, and I think that point is well taken. And incidentally, you'll be, that has been discussed at the highest levels, even within the government, that maybe some of this needs to be communicated more frequently, and not necessarily by the Prime Minister himself, because he should not be used all the time to communicate ideas. I mean, obviously, during the COVID crisis, his personal communication is important for going through lockdowns and masking up and all that, or vaccination. But as an ongoing basis, things like GST and explaining these things, that has to be better done. I agree with that.
I just want to quickly ask a follow-up question. One, did it achieve the objectives that it was set out to do? And in terms of the price that we paid, you could argue, but the price in terms of what we paid, which is the economic downturn, was it worth the benefit that it was thought demonetization could bring in? This is one question. And the second one is more general question, not in terms of any crisis, but given the nature of sluggish bureaucracy in India, in your personal capacity, not as a technocrat, but as a common man, what should be the balance that an efficient government should have between a liberal economic model, capitalist, and a restrictive one, i.e. the socialist? What should be under the control of government and what should not? If there is any specific model in the world that we can learn from, what would that be?
So I think the first question I answered largely in the last round. It did have some impact, no doubt. I mean, for example, digitization definitely took off in India because of that, and digital payments and so on. There's no question about that. Did it reduce black money? Well, I mean, anecdotally, I don't have any good sense of whether it did or not in terms of a hard study. But anecdotally, I think high-level corruption has definitely gone down in this country. Now, it may or may not be due to specifically demonetization, but I think demonetization can be seen as part of a wider effort to shut down the problem of regular scams that were happening at that time. And people forget the situation that was there immediately previous to that, where we used to get a scam a day. And so that has clearly got slowed down, and we haven't had those kinds of scandals, whether it is other scandal or many other kinds of scandals, banks and so on. That has certainly improved. I would argue most people would agree with that. Whether demonetization contributed to or not, I'll let you decide. Now comes the other question, which is more in my line of thinking, because I said I wasn't there at demonetization, so I can't comment on the original objectives of it. But certainly, as far as choosing between capitalism, capitalists, and other ways of thinking and the role of the state, let me first point out that I come from a third school, which is derived from complexity theory. So let me say a few things here in that context. Never confuse what benefits society with socialism, and never confuse capitalism with what benefits capitalists. Right? So, for example, the entire socialist period that you had, interestingly, when these socialist policies were introduced back in the 1950s, some of the most enthusiastic support for it came from the business community of that time, the Bombay Club. Why? Because effectively the license permit Raj was a good way of fossilizing their control over the business sector. And even in 1991, when we began to introduce and liberalize the economy, the biggest opponents of it were the bureaucrats and, interestingly, the capitalists of that time. What happened as a result is quite interesting. Between 1947 and the mid-90s, other than the one unique introduction of the Ambani family into the business class, essentially the same business class existed in 1995 or 1997 as in 1947. So you can clearly see that capitalism and socialism are not that separate from each other if you think of it in terms of who are the beneficiaries. And the point that I was making earlier was that both these systems are actually sister systems, essentially derived from the idea of an optimal equilibrium. They are only debating about the way to reach this optimal equilibrium. I come from a completely different school of thought, which is that I am debating whether this optimal equilibrium even exists. And therefore, the policies I will advocate are fundamentally different. That is why I am far more interested in legal reform than maybe somebody comes from either the socialist system or from the market system. I'm much more interested in administrative reform. I'm much more interested in deregulation and markets. But the reason I am in favor of markets is not because I think markets are efficient. I am quite convinced that they're inefficient, but because they are flexible, which is a different reason for being pro-market. Okay, I am pro-market because markets are flexible, simply because they allow, if things go wrong, they allow a correction somewhere down the line, which may be drastic and painful, but it allows that correction to happen. Okay, so this is a very different reasoning for being pro-market, but the way in which I'm pro-market is very different. I do not allow for efficient market hypothesis, for example. I am much more interested in the insolvency and bankruptcy code because I think things go wrong. The market will go wrong. So you have to allow for things to pick up the pieces regularly from things going wrong. So the advocacy of a complexity theory based system, you can call it complexity capitalism or whatever you want to call it. But this is a very different way of thinking. And there, by the way, I am drawing on a very rich lineage of thinking, by the way, which is there even in the 20th century, unfortunately not widely taught in Indian textbooks, but going to people like, for example, Friedrich Hayek. Right? Friedrich Hayek, one of the greatest economists of the 20th century in my view. Unfortunately, if you can be a PhD in economics in India, never have read a line of Hayek. But Hayek had, in his Nobel Prize speech, said something very interesting. He said, economists suffer from something called the pretense of knowledge, which is basically what I'm arguing against, that they pretend they know what the future is about when they don't. So complexity theory is an anecdote to this. And by the way, now this is gathering pace, and you can see writers, for example, like Nassim Taleb, sort of taking up some of these issues about black swans and things like that. So this line of thought has begun to gather steam. There are practitioners, or I'm still a minority in the universe of complexity theory practitioners, but there are some practitioners like myself who are coming through. But in India, there is a long lineage of thinking about these issues as well. Interestingly, Kautilya came from this, even though he may not have thought about it actively in this way, but it is quite interesting to even look at Kautilya's thoughts. Kautilya, if you read his economics, he is clearly not a socialist, but he's also clearly not a libertarian capitalist. He is very much an interventionist. But it is quite interesting to see what he wants the government to intervene in and what is his view of the state. So Kautilya was in favor of a strong but limited state. So let me contrast it with the Nehruvian or Ashokan weak but all-pervasive state. But notice, while Kautilya was in favor of a strong state, he was not in favor of an all-pervasive state. In fact, it's quite interesting. Many people know that Kautilya talks a lot about spies and keeping controls and so on. If you read it, it's quite interesting. You'll see that Kautilya is mostly suspicious not of the citizens, but of officials. In fact, he says that just like it is impossible to tell how a fish is drinking water, it is impossible to tell when a government official is skimming money. And so you'll discover that Kautilya is continuously arguing for regulation of but at the same time strictly limiting the powers of the official. So he is for example, not in favor of prohibition. Okay, he's in favor of regulation of bads, including prostitution. Right? He says that if you ban it, it's going to, the officials are going to make money out of it. So Kautilyan state is a very different kind of, from what many people think it is, both their proponents and his opponents. Kautilya is a proponent of the strong but limited state. And I, as a complexity theory man, am also a proponent of a strong but limited state. So therefore, you can see where I'm going with this. My proponent of all the deregulation I talked about comes from this line of the limited part of the state. My propounding for the next round of reforms being on the state doing the things it should do is also comes from the same thinking process that you should need a strong state. I'm not a proponent of a weak state. I am a proponent of a strong state. The state needs to invest in infrastructure. Hence, when we are reviving this economy, notice huge emphasis on demand management using capital expenditure. Our preference for spending on defense. It's about the strong state. So you can see where this entire thinking comes from. It's a consistent set of ideas which have deep lineage in both Western philosophy and Indian thinking.
We talked about so many sources of uncertainty, but one of those sources remains uncovered, not only in your talk, but in general, I am talking about. I'm not putting the point towards you, it is in general. And those sources of uncertainty are from factors like the geopolitics, which we have seen in Afghanistan recently, at the root of which is basically terrorism, right? Now, we cannot rule out that these kind of factors, these kind of social factors do affect the economics also. There is a lot of research, perhaps, which has already happened and even documented. There is a TED talk by Loretta Napoleoni, the economics of terror, for that matter. Even the system of the halal economy, as we all know.
So there is no question that geopolitics and evolving geopolitical equations have a huge role to play in economics. I don't think anybody, even in my talk, I referred to that repeatedly. There's no question about it. And the rise, for example, of Japan and Germany after the war is a geopolitical event as much as it is an economic event. The same thing is true of the rise of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, were also geopolitical events. Even the rise of China in the last 30 years is a geopolitical event because it is related directly to America's engagement with China in the 1970s. So there is no question in my mind that geopolitics cannot be thought of separately. And that is one of the points about complexity theory is that we do not think of various buckets separately. The whole point about complex systems thinking is that everything influences everything else, and it is meaningless to think about things separately. So I agree with you. Obviously, in a 1.5 hour talk, I can't get into everything, but you can see that, why this may have influenced the way we think about supply chains. Our participation, for example, in RCEP would have been at least partly covered by certain issues relating to geopolitics, not entirely though. This doesn't mean that we will not trade with RCEP countries. Of course we will, or that we will create a block against it. But it's an evolving thing in which we will evolve our strategies along the way. And similarly, it will influence the way we think about the people with whom we build geopolitical links, but also economic and investment links, trade links, and so on. And you will see a big influence of that into the near future. The kinds of, for example, 5G kinds of technology that we adopt will be obviously influenced by all of this. So there's no question in my mind that there is an influence of all of this in the way we think. And complexity theory, by its very definition, takes these things into account. Yeah, Bhargavji, your question?
The books by you, any books by the author, he asks.
By books by me?
Yeah,
Well, you can
lots
Google
of
them up. There are several of them. You can go into Amazon and have a look at them. My most recent book is actually a book of fiction, which is a book of satire about modern India called Life Over
Life
Two
Over
Beers.
2 Beers, right?
Yes, but I have written on, there's a bunch of my articles put together in something called India and the Age of Ideas, which is, a lot of it is about complexity theory. I've got history books. You can read Ocean of Churn. It's a maritime history. Or you can read my book, Land of Seven Rivers. Both of them, incidentally, are history written with, derived from a complexity theory perspective. And then there is my very first book going back quite some time back, 13, 14 years back, which is called The Indian Renaissance, where I talk about the rise of India after 1,000 years of decline. And of course, my own thoughts have evolved from then, but nevertheless, you will get a sense of the basic idea of complexity theory that I was sort of building at that time, 15, 20 years back, and arguing that flexibility will always trump strength and planning.
One topic he hasn't mentioned is history of India's geography. He talks about, and it's incredible towards the end of Land of Seven Rivers and other talks by him, where he actually talks how the cities evolved in India. Thank you very much, Sanjeev Sanyal ji.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.